If you ever find yourself standing near the ancient, rusting girders of the Blackwood iron span, when the night fog rolls off the river, listen closely to the metallic creaking above your head, because those are not structural groans, but the dying words of everyone who ever vanished into its shadow. The locals in the valley do not cross the span after sunset, nor do they drive through with their windows rolled down, because the iron is not just rust in the damp mountain air. It remembers. It reverberates, and when the air turns cold enough, it speaks in the exact voices of those it swallowed whole. Built in late 1898 to connect a long-abandoned mining settlement with the rest of the county, the iron span was an engineering marvel of its time. Constructed entirely out of massive, hand-riveted dark iron plates that stretched 300 feet across a jagged, bottomless gorge. But during its 5-year construction, disaster plagued the project. Dozens of steelworkers plunged into the black waters below, their bodies pinned under falling iron beams, never to be recovered from the crushing currents. When the mining boom failed and the town dried up, the bridge remained isolated in the dense pine forests, quietly absorbing the tragic history of the valley until the metal itself seemed to develop a terrifying kind of acoustic memory. Arthur was an investigative journalist and urban explorer who specialized in debunking regional myths for his popular online video channel, making a career out of visiting places that terrify normal people and proving there was nothing to fear except drafty floorboards and bad plumbing. He had driven 3 hours through torrential autumn rain to reach the edge of the valley, lured by stories on obscure internet forums about a forgotten bridge where visitors reportedly heard their own missing family members whispering to them inside the metal girders. Armed with high-end directional microphones, audio recorders, and a heavy-duty tactical flashlight, Arthur parked his SUV at the trailhead, pulled on his waterproof jacket, and hiked the half-mile through the dripping forest until the massive, blackened silhouette of the iron span emerged from the gray mist like the ribcage of an ancient dead beast. The air around the ravine was unnaturally still, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of oxidized iron mixed with the earthy stench of wet fallen leaves and stagnant water. As Arthur stepped onto the heavy wooden planks that lined the roadway of the bridge, his boots made a dull, damp sound that felt immediately swallowed up by the vast, empty air of the canyon. He pulled out his handheld recorder, flicked the power switch, and adjusted his headphones, watching the visual audio meters bounce faintly as the microphone picked up the natural ambiance, the distant rushing of the river below and the soft drip of water falling from the high iron trusses above. Testing, audio track 1. Arthur spoke softly into his clip-on mic, his voice flat and analytical. I am standing at the southern entrance of the Blackwood iron span. Temperature is roughly 4 degrees Celsius. Dense fog. So far, no acoustic anomalies, just standard structural settling. He began walking slowly along the edge of the walkway, sweeping his flashlight beam across the massive iron rivets that held the crossbeams together, noting how heavily rusted and pitted the metal was after a century of neglect. The bridge seemed solid, but as he reached the 50-foot mark, the wind suddenly died down completely, leaving behind a silence so dense and pressurized that Arthur could hear the frantic ticking of his own wristwatch. Then, his headphones crackled with a burst of static that made him jump. It was not the electric hum of a dying battery or radio interference. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to originate from deep within the iron beam right beside his left shoulder. Arthur stopped, raising his flashlight to the thick metal pillar, bringing his microphone closer to the surface. Through his headphones, the static smoothed out into a distinct rhythmic hum, sounding remarkably like a choir of voices humming a single sorrowful note in unison. Fascinating, Arthur murmured, leaning in closer. The hollow iron beams appeared to act as a natural acoustic chamber, trapping wind currents and creating a standing wave effect. He reached out a gloved hand and placed his palm against the cold, damp iron to feel the vibration. But the moment his fingers touched the metal, the humming stopped instantly. In its place came a sound that made every drop of blood in his veins turn to ice. A voice, soft, trembling, and unmistakably human, whispered directly out of the rivet hole, inches from his fingers. Arthur, please, it's so heavy down here. Arthur tore his hand away from the beam, stumbling back a step as his heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped bird. The voice belonged to his older brother, David, who had gone missing during a solo kayaking trip in these very mountains. 6 years ago, a loss that had fractured Arthur's family and haunted his every waking thought ever since. David? Arthur gasped out loud, forgetting his recording equipment, forgetting his professional detachment, forgetting every rule of logic he had built his life upon. We couldn't get out. Arthur, the voice from the iron continued, shifting slightly in pitch, the sound echoing through the hollow framework of the bridge so that it seemed to come from above, below, and beside him all at once. The water took us, but the iron kept us. Come closer. We can hear you so clearly now. Reason screamed at Arthur to turn around and run back to his SUV. But the emotional gravity of his brother's voice was an immovable force, dragging him deeper onto the span. He took another step forward, his flashlight beam shaking so violently that the shadows of the iron trusses danced like leaping figures across the wooden deck. As he walked, another voice joined the first, a woman's voice. Weeping softly, her words emerging from a horizontal support beam near his waist. "Tell my mother I tried to swim," the woman's voice sobbed, the metallic acoustic quality making it sound as though she were speaking through a long, rusty pipe from deep underground. "Tell her the water was too dark." Then a third voice spoke from the iron arch above his head, this one a man's raspy, gasping voice. "My legs are stuck under the beam. Someone turn off the engine. Please, someone turn off the engine." The bridge was no longer silent. It was alive with a terrifying, overlapping symphony of human agony. Dozens of distinct voices, men, women, and children, were whispering, weeping, and calling out from every single joint, rivet, and plate of the massive steel structure. The sound vibrated through the wooden planks beneath Arthur's boots, traveling up his skeleton, until his teeth chattered with the frequency of their collective sorrow. Arthur held his hands over his headphones, but it was useless. The sound was not just in his ears. It was coming from the air itself, resonating in the chest cavity of his body. He shone his flashlight up at the high trusses, and his breath caught in his throat. The fog clinging to the upper structure was shifting, taking on the subtle, translucent outlines of human figures trapped inside the metal frame, their arms stretched outward, as if trying to push their way through the solid iron plates. "This isn't real," Arthur whispered frantically, pulling off his headphones and throwing them to the ground. "It's an auditory hallucination. Infrasound. It has to be infrasound." "It is real, Arthur," his brother's voice called out again, this time louder, emerging from a massive junction plate right in front of him. "Look at the metal. Look at what we left behind." Hypnotized by fear and grief, Arthur pointed his flashlight at the junction plate. The thick layer of reddish-brown rust on the iron surface was moving, flaking away in real time, as if being scratched off from the inside. Beneath the falling rust, the bare iron was not smooth. It was embossed with the faint, frantic impressions of human faces and pressing hands, pushing against the interior of the hollow beam as if the entire bridge were a hollow steel coffin packed with endless, struggling bodies. A sudden sharp metallic clang echoed through the canyon. Like a sledgehammer striking an anvil, the entire bridge shuddered violently under Arthur's feet, throwing him off balance. He fell hard onto his knees, dropping his tactical flashlight, which rolled across the damp wood, its beam illuminating the terrifying truth of the span. The wooden planks ahead of him were beginning to split and pull apart, not from age, but because the iron girders on either side were slowly contracting, bending inward toward the center of the walkway like a crushing cage. Join the chorus. Arthur! A chorus of 100 voices echoed simultaneously from the metal around him, their tone no longer sad or pleading, but hungry, cruel, and unified. The iron needs new breath. The span needs new sound. Panicked, Arthur scrambled to his feet and turned to run back toward the southern bank. But the bridge was changing behind him. The fog had turned thick and black, swallowing the trail, while the iron trusses on both sides had bent inward so severely that the walkway was now a narrow, suffocating corridor of cold, sweating metal. The whispering was no longer coming from inside the beams. Long, dark, metallic tendrils were unfurling from the rivet holes, reaching out like iron vines, snapping toward his jacket and legs. Arthur sprinted with everything he had, his boots slamming into the trembling wood, dodging the cold metal strands that whipped through the fog. A tendril grazed his cheek, leaving a freezing, burning welt that smelled strongly of old blood and river silt. He heard his brother's voice one last time, screaming from the girder directly beside his ear, sounding frantic and desperate. "Run, Arthur! Don't let it catch your voice." With a final desperate leap, Arthur threw his body forward through the narrowing gap of the iron entrance frame, crashing face first into the wet, muddy embankment of the forest trail. He tumbled down the dirt slope, rolling until he slammed against the trunk of an old oak tree. Gasping for air, his chest burning, and his face dripping with mud and cold sweat, he scrambled to his feet and looked back at the iron span. The bridge sat entirely motionless in the dark. The violent contracting of the girders had stopped. The black tendrils were gone, and the heavy iron arches stood rigid and silent under the light mountain rain, looking once again like nothing more than an innocent, abandoned piece of 19th century engineering. Arthur stood there for a long time in the dark, his body shaking uncontrollably, listening to the quiet patter of rain on the forest leaves. He reached into his coat pocket, his trembling fingers wrapping around his backup audio recorder, which had been running in his pocket the entire time. He pulled it out, pressed the stop button, and hit play, holding the tiny speaker up to his ear to prove to himself that it had all been a mental breakdown brought on by exhaustion and grief. The recording played back smoothly. The sound of his own breathing filled the small speaker, followed by the crunch of his boots on the wood. But then came the moment he had touched the iron beam. There was no sound of his brother's voice on the tape. There were no weeping women, no screaming workmen, and no sound of shifting metal. There was only a single, crystal-clear audio recording of Arthur's own voice, speaking in a flat, monotone whisper that he had no memory of ever uttering. "I am standing on the iron. I am never going home. My name is Arthur, and this is where I stay." Arthur dropped the recorder into the mud, backed away slowly toward his vehicle, and never returned to the valley. But locals say that if you cross the Blackwood iron span on a quiet autumn night, among the dozens of forgotten voices trapped inside the rusting beams, there is a new voice, clearer and fresher than the rest, desperately trying to tell anyone who will listen that he should have stayed in his car. If you ever drive down Route 9 near the edge of Oakhaven County late at night, you will notice that every local driver lowers their sun visor, keeps their chin pointed straight at the road, and refuses to glance sideways even for a fraction of a second. They are not staring ahead because they are cautious drivers. They are doing it because everyone in the valley knows what sits beneath the rusted iron structure of the Oakhaven Bridge. The rule of the crossing is brutally simple and absolute. Pay the toll with your silence. Keep your eyes on the yellow pavement lines. And no matter what voice calls your name from the dark water beneath, never, ever look below. The bridge was built back in 1932 during the height of the Great Depression, throwing a massive arch of black steel across a jagged stone gorge where the Blackwood River churned 80 feet below. In those desperate years, the gorge became a tragic magnet for lost souls, a place where broken people came in the dead of night to step off the wooden walkways into the roaring pitch-black water. But local folklore says the canyon was never truly empty to begin with. Something ancient and starving lived in the deep, stagnant pools beneath the rocks, catching those who fell and learning the shape of their voices, the cadence of their laughter, and the deepest regrets they carried into the water. By the time the old wooden footpaths were replaced with modern asphalt and concrete, the entity beneath the arches had learned how to hunt, turning the bridge into an open trap for anyone foolish, enough to let their eyes wander past the guardrails. Marcus was not a local, which made him the exact kind of victim the bridge seemed to wait for. He was a 28-year-old freelance graphic designer, driving home from a late-night meeting in the neighboring city, navigating his old sedan through a thick, wall-like fog that had rolled into the valley around 2 in the morning. His phone had died an hour earlier, his GPS was useless, and the dashboard clock flickered with a weak, amber glow that felt like the only warm thing left in the universe. When his headlights finally caught the towering iron archway of Oakhaven Bridge, he felt a wave of relief, thinking he was finally close to the main highway. That would take him back to civilization. He slowed his car down as he hit the concrete decking, the tires making a rhythmic, hollow humming sound against the damp road surface. Thrum, 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 thrum. The sound echoed off the high steel trusses above, swallowed almost instantly by the heavy, oppressive silence of the surrounding forest. As Marcus drove deeper onto the span, the fog grew so dense that his high beams were reflected right back into his eyes, creating a blinding white wall that reduced his visibility to just a few feet in front of the hood. He leaned forward, gripping the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, trying desperately to follow the faded yellow line painted down the middle of the road. That was when the first sound broke through the engine's quiet purr. It was not a screech of metal or the howl of the wind rushing through the canyon. It was a knock. A soft, clear double tap right on the passenger side door window. Tap, tap. Marcus flinched, his heart instantly leaping into his throat. He kept his eyes locked on the windshield, refusing to turn his head toward the side glass, telling himself it was just a loose pebble kicked up by his front tire or a stray tree branch blown through the fog. But deep down, he knew the branch theory was impossible. There were no trees on the bridge deck, only open air and 80 feet of empty space down to the river. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, but the car felt strangely heavy, as if the tires were pushing through deep, sticky mud rather than flat asphalt. The engine groaned. The speedometer needle stuck stubbornly at 15 miles per hour, refusing to budge no matter how hard he pushed his foot down. The air inside the cab turned rapidly frigid, his breath pluming in thick white clouds against the windshield, while a strange, damp smell began to seep in through the climate vents. The heavy, nauseating stench of stagnant river water, rot, and wet soil. Then came the voice. "Marcus." The voice did not come from the radio, nor did it come from the back seat. It came from directly outside his left window, hovering right beside his ear, separated from him by only a thin pane of glass. It was soft, hesitant, and intimately familiar. It was the voice of his mother, who had passed away in a quiet hospital room 3 years prior. "Marcus, please stop the car," the voice whispered, trembling with an emotion so genuine that a tear instinctively welled up in the corner of Marcus's left eye. "It's so cold down here. I've been waiting for you to come pick me up. Just pull over and look at me." Every instinct embedded in human psychology demanded that he turn his head. When a loved one calls out in pain, your body moves before your mind can process logic. Marcus felt his chin begin to drift to the left, his eyes straining to catch a glimpse of the window frame out of the corner of his eye. He could see a pale, wet shape pressed against the glass, a dark silhouette of a face, surrounded by strands of long, dripping hair that clung to the damp window like black weeds. "Don't look." A quiet, forgotten memory suddenly echoed in the back of his brain. He remembered a gas station attendant 10 miles back, an old man with milky eyes who had handed him his coffee and said with absolute, chilling seriousness, "If you take the old bridge, keep your eyes on the yellow line. Don't look down, don't look out the glass. And no matter who calls you, keep driving until the iron arches end." Marcus bit his lower lip so hard he tasted copper, forcing his eyes back onto the yellow line glowing under his headlights. "You're not real," he croaked, his voice barely a squeak against the cold air inside the car. The moment he spoke those words, the gentle, weeping tone of his mother's voice vanished, replaced instantly by a wet, gurgling sound, like someone trying to breathe with lungs full of river mud. The thing outside the window didn't walk or run alongside the moving car. It simply floated beside the driver's door, matching the sedan's speed effortlessly as it glided across the fog. Tap, 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 tap. The tapping on the glass grew faster and more urgent, turning into a heavy, wet pounding that made the entire door panel vibrate. "Marcus, look at me," a new voice screamed. This time it was his younger sister, her tone sharp with agonizing terror. "I fell off the edge. I'm hanging on the railing below your door. Look down and give me your hand." "My fingers are slipping, Marcus." "Look down." The sheer panic in the voice was so overwhelming that Marcus almost slammed on the brakes. His eyes darted down toward the bottom of his driver's side door. Out of his lower peripheral vision, he could see something pale reaching up over the doorsill, a long, gray hand with elongated, extra-jointed fingers, its fingernails black and cracked, leaving long trails of dark slime against the red paint of his car. The arm stretched upward from beneath the frame of the vehicle, coming straight out of the pitch-black abyss below the bridge structure. "Look down!" The thing shrieked, its voice shifting again, blending dozens of different human voices together into a chaotic, overlapping chorus of men, women, and children all screaming the same desperate command. "Look down. Look at us. Pay the toll. Look below." The car's dashboard lights began to flicker wildly, the headlights dimming until they were nothing more than two tiny yellow sparks in the impenetrable fog. The temperature dropped so drastically that frost began to form on the inside of the windshield, creeping inward from the edges like white spiderwebs, slowly closing off his narrow view of the yellow road line. The entire car began to rock violently from side to side, as if invisible hands were reaching up from the gorge beneath, grabbing the undercarriage and trying to pull the vehicle over the low concrete barrier into the black water below. Marcus screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror, but he refused to shift his gaze. He locked his vision on the tiny patch of clear glass directly in front of him, staring at the faint yellow paint on the ground as if his very soul depended on it. He clamped his hands onto the wheel, ignoring the wet, slapping sounds echoing from the roof of his car, ignoring the heavy weight that had just slammed onto the trunk lid, causing the rear suspension to groan under a sudden, unnatural load. Something leaned down over the front windshield from the roof. A face slid upside down into his field of view, hanging directly in front of his eyes. But it wasn't a face. It was a ghastly, stretched canvas of gray skin with no eyes, no nose, and a vast gaping slit for a mouth that stretched from ear to ear, filled with rows of needle-thin, translucent teeth. It had stolen the hair of his mother, the jawline of his sister, and the weeping eyes of a dozen strangers, all stitched together into an unnatural, shifting mess of stolen human features. "Look at me." The thing didn't speak through the air. The command slammed directly inside Marcus's skull, vibrating his teeth and causing a burst of blinding pain behind his eyes. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut for a terrifying 2 seconds, relying entirely on his muscle memory to keep the steering wheel straight. He pounded his foot onto the accelerator with every ounce of strength left in his body, willing the dying car to move forward. The engine let out a deafening metallic shriek. The transmission clunked violently, and the car lurched forward with a sudden burst of speed. Thump, clack. The tires hit a solid, raised pavement seam, and instantly, the heavy weight on the roof was thrown backward into the dark. The freezing air inside the cab evaporated, replaced instantly by the warm air of his car's heater. The horrific chorus of screaming voices stopped so abruptly that the silence hurt his ears, replaced once again by the simple, natural sound of tires rolling over gravel and dry dirt. Marcus opened his eyes and slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a skidding halt on the dirt shoulder of Route 9. He sat there in the dark, gasping for breath, his entire body trembling so violently that he could barely keep his hands on the wheel. Chest heaving, he stared at his rearview mirror, but the glass was completely fogged over with white frost. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out his trembling hand and used his thumb to wipe a small, clear circle in the frost of his driver's side window. He looked back toward the road. Behind his car, 200 yards away, the giant iron archway of Oakhaven Bridge sat quietly in the moonlight, surrounded by peaceful drifting banks of gray mist. There were no voices, no shapes, and no screaming faces, just an old, silent bridge stretching across a dark canyon. Marcus let out a long, shaky exhale and leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes as a wave of relief washed over him. He had survived. He had followed the rule, kept his eyes forward, and made it across the crossing intact. He reached down to turn on the interior dome light, wanting nothing more than to see the safe, familiar space of his car's cabin. He flipped the switch, and the overhead light bathed the front seats in a soft yellow glow. As Marcus took a deep breath to calm his racing heart, his eyes caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror. Directly behind his seat, sitting quietly in the center of the dark rear bench, was a small, soaking wet pile of river weeds and mud. And as he watched in frozen horror through the mirror, 2 long, gray, extra-jointed hands slowly rose up from the darkness of the floorboards, reaching up to wrap their wet fingers around the back of his headrest, while a soft, wet whisper echoed from the dark space right behind his ear. "You didn't look below, but you looked back." The cold mist off the Blackwood River had a way of turning the iron beams of old Miller's Bridge into dripping, blackened skeletons. For over 40 years, the locals of the valley had lived by a single, unwritten law that everyone understood, but no one dared speak aloud. If you must cross the bridge after midnight, you keep moving, you look straight ahead, and no matter how heavy the air becomes behind you, you never stop to check who is following. They called it the Bridge of Lost Footsteps, not because people went missing on the span itself, but because of what happened to the rhythm of your own boots as you walked across. The phenomenon always began the exact moment your feet left the dirt road and struck the wet wooden planks of the crossing. At first, you would hear only the standard sound of your own pace, tap, tap, tap against the timber. But by the time you reached the quarter mark, a second sound would emerge from the fog behind you. It was not an echo, because an echo mimics your rhythm perfectly. This sound was slightly off, a fraction of a second late, like a second pair of bare, wet feet dragging across the planks just 3 paces back. If you sped up, the wet, dragging steps sped up too. If you slowed down to test your mind, the footsteps matched your exact delay. But the terror was not the sound following you. The true nightmare was what happened as you approached the middle of the bridge, because that was when the second pair of footsteps would begin to catch up, moving past your shoulder while you were still walking forward, passing you from behind even though the air beside you remained entirely empty. Clara had heard the story since she was a child, but like most people who spent their lives living next to something cursed, familiarity had bred a quiet, dangerous arrogance. She was 22, working the late shift at the timber mill on the north side of the river, and on a frozen Tuesday in November, her old pickup truck died in the parking lot. With no cell service in the deep valley and the temperature dropping fast, enough to freeze water in midair, she had only two choices: freeze in the cab until morning, or take the 40-minute walk home across Old Miller's Bridge. She wrapped her heavy wool coat tightly around her chest, pulled her beanie down over her ears, and set off into the dark. The night was dead silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and pressurized, pressing against your eardrums like deep water. The moon was nothing more than a pale, milky smudge behind thick purple clouds, offering just enough faint light to trace the dark silhouette of the bridge ahead. As Clara approached the south entrance of the span, she paused at the edge where the gravel met the wood. The river below was high and fast, roaring like a muffled engine in the ravine, but the sound felt distant, swallowed up by the thick bank of fog hovering over the water. She took a deep breath, focused her eyes on the dim light of the lane on the far side, and stepped onto the first plank. Thump! The sound of her heavy leather boot echoed out into the dark. She took 3 more steps, forcing a steady, fast pace. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then came the 5th step, and with it, the change in the air. It started as a subtle drop in temperature, a cold draft that didn't feel like the wind, but rather like someone standing very close and breathing out a long, frozen exhale onto the back of her neck. Clara tightened her grip on her coat pockets and kept her eyes locked on the trees across the river. Thump, slap. There it was. Behind the solid, heavy strike of her boot came a soft, wet impact against the wood. It sounded like bare skin hitting damp timber. She did not stop. She had remembered the warning her grandfather gave her when she was 10 years old. It feeds on your hesitation, Clara. The moment you stop to listen, you give it permission to settle. She kept her pace steady, but her heart began to hammer violently against her ribs. Thump, slap. Thump, slap. Thump, slap. The footsteps behind her were no longer trailing by 3 paces. They were closing the distance. With every step she took, the wet, dragging sound moved closer, until it felt as though whatever was behind her was walking so close that its chest was almost touching her back. She could feel a strange, static pressure in the air, the kind of feeling you get right before a lightning strike, making the tiny hairs on her arms stand up beneath her thick sweater. By the time she reached the center of the bridge, the rhythm changed entirely. This was the moment everyone in the valley feared, the threshold where the legend turned into something physical. The wet footsteps behind her did not stay behind her. Without accelerating, without changing pace, the sound began to creep up along her left side. Thump, her right boot. Slap, the wet foot now directly beside her left ankle. Clara's instinct screamed at her to turn her head, to look sideways, to confirm that there was nothing there, but she forced her chin forward, staring intently at the white paint peeling off the guardrail 50 feet ahead. Out of the extreme edge of her peripheral vision, she saw the fog distorting. It wasn't a shadow or a solid form, but a tall, dark smudge in the mist, shaped vaguely like a person stretched out too thin, moving at the exact same speed as her. The air on her left side turned violently cold, so cold that the skin on her cheek went numb in seconds. Thump, slap, thump, slap. The entity was not just walking beside her now, it was passing her. The wet, dragging sound moved half a pace ahead of her stride. Claire watched the empty air in front of her on the left side, and as she did, her breath hitched in her throat. Deep, wet indentations were appearing. On the wooden planks just inches in front of her own feet, footprints forming out of nowhere, pressed into the damp wood by an invisible weight, leaving behind small pools of black, stagnant river water that smelled faintly of decay and old iron. The worst part was the sound that came with the forward footsteps. It was not just the impact of feet on wood. It was a voice. It was a faint, raspy whisper that seemed to come not from the air around her, but from inside her own head, perfectly synchronized with the wet footsteps ahead. Left, right, give me your stride. Clara felt a sudden, terrifying heaviness in her legs. It felt as if her own muscles were trying to slow down, as if her body wanted to surrender its movement to the rhythm of the phantom leading her. She realized with a flash of pure panic what the old stories actually meant. The entity didn't want to attack you from behind. It wanted to lead you. If you matched your footsteps to its pace once it passed you, you would never walk off the bridge. You would keep walking into the fog, stepping off the edge of the wood into the black gorge below, thinking you were simply following the path home. "No," she whispered under her breath, her voice shaking violently. She broke the rhythm. Instead of taking another steady step, she lunged forward, taking 2 short, awkward, frantic strides to break the pattern. Instantly, a high, piercing screech echoed from the iron girders. Above her, a sound like metal grinding against metal, mixed with a wet, angry gasp. The wet footprints in front of her stopped instantly. The air grew impossibly thick, like walking through cold water, pressing against her chest so hard that she could barely draw breath. Clara didn't look back. She didn't look left, and she didn't look right. She sprinted. Her boots slammed against the wooden planks in a frantic, uneven chaos. Thump, 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 thump. Behind her, the entity reacted to her speed. The wet, dragging sound transformed into a violent, rapid slap against the timber, no longer mimicking a human walk, but sounding like something flat and heavy leaping across the wood, closing the gap at terrifying speed. 10 feet to the end of the bridge. 8 feet. 5 feet. She felt a cold, wet sensation brush against the back of her coat, like dripping fingers snatching at the fabric. The smell of rot filled her nose, so strong it made her gag. She closed her eyes for a split second, threw her entire body weight forward, and lunged across the final beam of the bridge structure. Her boots hit the rough, solid dirt of the North Bank Road. The moment her feet struck the earth, the suffocating pressure vanished. The freezing wind dropped. The smell of old iron and decay evaporated into the night air, and the violent splashing footstep behind her instantly ceased. Clara fell to her knees on the gravel, gasping for air, her chest heaving as tears of pure adrenaline ran down her freezing cheeks. She stayed there on all fours for a long time, listening to the quiet rustle of the pine trees and the steady, natural roar of the river below. Slowly, carefully, she turned her head to look back at Old Miller's Bridge. The span sat quiet and empty under the dim moonlight, wrapped in its blanket of gray fog. There was no one on the wood, no movement in the mist. But as she shone the flashlight from her phone back toward the bridge, her heart froze all over again, starting from the middle of the bridge and running, all the way to the edge where the wood met the dirt were fresh, wet footprints left in the timber. They ended precisely at the line where the dirt began, and as she watched, the small pools of black water in those footprints began to bubble faintly, as if waiting for the next person to step onto the wood.